This is a Celebration 125 podcast. Bunk, when was your first memory back in your childhood? When was your first memory, and roughly what year would that be, that you knew about logging?
About 1940 when I first remembered. I was born up on the end of Chaplin Road. You go up towards Seabird Island and turn off on Chaplin Road. And right on the end, Dad had rented 21 acres from a guy in Chilliwack, Herb Young. And before my time, I don't remember that, but there was a shingle mill in Walleach. You go up Seabird Island and there's a big pile of gravel there now. There used to be a railway station and a couple of railroad houses. And right at the end of Walleach Road, like there's still a sign there. They get still used. And then when Dad rented that place, I don't remember it, but it had been the cedar taken off. And an old guy that owned it was Bruff by name. And he sold the cedar to this Lattice. It was a shingle outfit from Rosedale. And they built their mill right next to the railway at Walleach. So anyway, when Dad looked at it, they had fell all the cedar on Springboard because they're all swollen butt. Cedar is like how a cedar grows. They're big at the bottom and a lot of taper, and you got to get up. Some of them were up about, I'd say, just remember, about 12 feet. Him and another guy named Jerry Nelson, they figured, well, shingle bolts were a big seller then. Like they were, I believe they were 4 foot by 8 inches or 4 foot 4, old growth cedar, like they were made for shingles. He had always had a team of horses and whatnot, and he made a deal with Herb Young to, what they did was buck the cedar off down near the ground where they could get 2 shingle bolts out of them, and then put an undercut in them, and then back cut, and then just power buckle them off because they wouldn't fall off the big stump very good. And they always had the wedge lots because I remember Dad was always saying, like he was always carving wood wedges, and then use a bite of a line in the team, like choke it to one stump and then go around like power buckle and pull it off. And then they had a Ree McGregor, which was, well, it was something. They're quite a rig. I thought it was a fine rig. It had an old one-lunger engine on it and a little sleigh, and it was like a drag saw. It had almost like a hand bucking saw on it, and they spiked it to the log once they figured where they were going to cut it, and then fired up the old one-lunger, and it was the water block one-lunger engine. There used to be quite a few of them around. And it put away, and they threw kerosene on the saw blade just so it made a bit better cutting. And then with wedges and hammer, they would split these shingle bolts. Well, they were bigger than I was then. Well, we were a kid. I remember them. A Picaroon was quite a tool with shingle bolts. They used it for everything. They stood it and rolled it over, and when they loaded it on a wagon to get it out of the brush, Dad he had a steel wheel wagon, and they would stand the bunch on end, and then take the pick or Picaroon, and then pull it up into the wagon. And then it's hard to explain, but they'd stand them on end, and then he'd yard them. He'd take them with a team out to the side of the road where a truck could pick them up, and then they piled them out there. And that he did that for, I would say, a couple of years. But when I found out there was kind of a funny-looking thing, what it was a broken ox yoke. And then as I found out when I got older, down at the far end of the property, again, the mountain, there was a funny kind of a big old shed. And in the one corner, there was a bunch of black stuff. I used to get dirty in it, and Mom would give me the devil for that. But what it was, I think, was they had the oxen, they swung from the bush to the back slough with oxen out of the mud like and whatnot. And then from there, they had horses to swing out to, and Peters Road, if you go up Seabird just past our old place, there's a road, well, Harold Peters, and they all live on it. And that went straight out to the shingle mill out in Walleach. And the horses were better on, well, it was a little better ground. It was level ground. And they had, I don't know, there must have been about 10 Chinese guys, and they had grub hoes. And they grub hoed the road from the slough up to the main road. And then a grub hoe is like, I don't really know the real name. It's like a Fox number 2 shovel, only Lou Herman used to make them, and they bent it in a right angle and cut the end of, like, made a big hole out of it. And then that way, you dug it in and pulled it towards you, and they had these guys doing that. And then they were from, Art Green was logging Agassiz Mountain at the time, like that's a mountain behind the experimental farm.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And they grub hoed a road up to the top of that came down right on the end, right when you go in Chaplin Road. There used to be a bridge, it's a culvert now, you go over it and then go down, and right, Giesbrick has that place now. When you went over the next fill, which used to be a bridge, if you head straight for Agassiz Mountain there, that's where the road went up, and they had a bridge over that back slough, and that road switched back up to, but it was all built by these Chinese guys, and it was just a dirt road. Well, then that's where these guys, I guess Dad and Jerry got them from there. They, across Mariah's Slough, where they crossed right above our place, there was what you call a ripple, where the water's, well, it's a salmon spawning ground. It's what it is, but it was just a place where the water wasn't too deep where they could get across. And then they took a whole bunch of old alders, cotton, everything they could find, corduroyed across the slough so the horses could walk on that, like, instead of going, there was always a bit of mud on top of the gravel, but that whole area is all river gravel, like it was made by the river, so it's hard underneath, but there's mud on top of it. They originally, that place was logged, and they fell it with springboards because of the shingle guys. They didn't want those swollen butts. They took the best part of the log, took all the cedar, and they took some from Seabird and some from the Cunningham Ranch, which is, it's number 2. Well, it'd be the same as the experimental farm. They ended up with it, but it used to be owned by Cunningham, who had drugstores in Vancouver. But they took all the cedar from that to that shingle mill, and then that's about the first of the logging we did. And then when Art Green got going, they horse logged Agassiz Mountain on the Seabird side, like the north side. I know Dad had a team of horses there. My granddad and 2 or 3 other guys they were horse logging. Yarding into the mill, he ended up with a mill on there. and then I believe it was softwood.
Mm-hmm.
They yarded it down the road, and out in the field, they had put a couple of dead men in to hold the gin pole guy lines to it.
What did you say? You said dead men?
What's that?
Did you say dead men?
Yeah, you call it a dead man. You dig a hole and then put a chunk like a chunk of log or wood, and then wrap a guy line around it, choke it, and then bury it. And then from there you go. Once it's choked, and then you bury it, and then you can make a tail hold out of it. You can use it. It's like an anchor. Mm-hmm. And then they raised a gin pole, which is just two logs, and tied together on top with a block hung on it, and then on about a 45-degree angle. It was called a gin pole, like everybody used them then. Mm-hmm. And then on the block, a farmer used a hay fork to put hay in the barn. This was the same idea. I was always quite interested in that stuff anyway. And then they'd have like an old horse, or usually something that was too old really to work hard, and it would just pull the line, and they used it for loading, like loading log. They'd lift one log with it and then drop it on the truck. Mm-hmm. And it was quite hard on trucks then, because they drug it up over the side of the stake and then just swung it in and dropped it. All the trucks I remember then didn't have any doors and were all shy fenders, and there was one that Art Green had. It would be a fairly new Ford. This would be, I would say, 1940, 41. We were still, I wasn't going to school, so I'd walk down there with Mom, and Chess Chaplin Englert lived in Chaplin's farm, and we'd walk by, but I'd always stay and watch the goings-on, which was quite, to me, was just heaven. So anyway, Tommy Jackson was the truck driver, and he even let me sit in this truck, and it was a 40 Ford. It was a little tandem and had a tandem trailer. They loaded softwood on it, and I'm not sure what mill, if it went to Harrison, there was a mill there then, or where it went. The horses swung right down into there, and that's where that was the landing. When they got down around the point where the slough goes right up to the bottom of the mountain there, it's steeper ground. Dad had got an old Belgium, or they're fairly big old horse, Samson by name, and he just used him single, not a team, because the team was too wide. And on the steep ground, they used it, and it was fairly good old horse. He could hook the turn up, and it would head right to the landing, and then somebody there would unhook the turn, and the old horse would turn around and go back to where Dad was. Mind you, Dad always had some oats to give it, and I think that's probably how he did it. But they logged the whole face of that, and there was another guy, Johnny Bob. He had a team, but he was down to one horse too, and the steep ground, they used it to go along the face. They just used the one horse, and that was the first logging I'd ever seen. And then the one day it showed up, I had never saw one before, but it was a 15 gas cat that Pretty's had, and I think it was Harry Pretty from, it'd be Finn's brother, Charlie's brother too, and it was something, but it was about this, not much bigger than a bobcat is now, like in them days, and it had a little winch on it, and he was yarding logs with it too, but it scared the horses pretty bad. It had a gas engine in it, but I was really impressed with that rig. That's basically where we got into logging, mm-hmm. And then it was Dad went from there and he went up the lake. When I was in grade 1, I made a deal. Like I didn't like school that much, and if you pass out of grade 1, you can come up to camp in the summertime.
Now, Bunk, we're talking Harrison Lake, right?
Yeah, and 20 Mile Bay.
Mm-hmm.
It was owned by Clark Brothers. So anyway, I did pass. So then I got my trip to 20 Mile where Dad, and they worked 5.5 hours a week then, or I should say they came home Saturday at noon. Anyway, it was different then. I went up on the Tarquin, which went up on Tuesday. Mom took me out there. I would be 7 years old then. There was another, she would be a teenager, a girl, and she was Les Trethui's daughter. And I guess she kind of felt sorry for this punk kid going up there. And old Danny Peralt, he was the engineer on the Tarquin. He gave me a hamburger. And anyway, when we got to 20 Mile, that's where this Trethui girl was going because her dad worked for Harold Clark. The Clark brothers owned that kind of camp then. And then on the way up at 10 Mile Bay, there was a truck dumping, and then it turned around, and right out of camp there was a steep hill, and I was watching that thing climbing up there. They were gas trucks, and they were just not much more than 3 tons. They're a little guy. But anyway, in them days it was. And then as we get off at 20 Mile, I couldn't believe all the stuff that was around there. There was a bunch of bunkhouses, and then the shop, and then it had big open doors, and there was a truck there, and the steering wheel was on the other side. I kind of noted that kind of a funny-looking rig, and it had now it was a Leland First World War right-hand drive with a C cab, like no doors or anything. Mm-hmm. There was a guy there, and I think he was fueling it up, and I guess he wondered what the kid's doing there. And it was a guy by the name of Bill Drader. He drove that truck, and then you could hear it banging and roaring, and in come another. It had a load of logs on it, so I run down to the A-frame where they dumped the logs into the water. They had like an A-frame there. The same idea, only they had stumps for tail holts for the 2 guy lines. Dump machine was a little yarder, with like winches on it, and they were pile driving winch because it had the dogs on the drum. Like a pile driver always had, it's almost like a gear around the outside of the drum, and a dog where they could, instead of just trusting the brake, I guess when they had the hammer in the air, you put it on, sat it on the dog where it wouldn't come down on anybody. Well, anyway, Gordon Carr was the guy that run the dump machine, and that driver, his name was Frank Bohack, and it's real funny because I worked with these guys later on. It was probably, I was in my teens, and I worked with the same guys that only I had to tell them who I was because they never realized I was that punk that was around there.
Bunk, so this would be in what, the early 1950s?
Yeah, no, 40. Let's see, I'm born in 36, so I would have turned 7. So what, that'd be 42?
No, but when you said when you were in your teens.
Oh yeah, I started in 51.
Yeah.
And then I worked with Bohack. Heck, that would have been probably in the 60s. He was working for driving truck for W&W. That was Simpsons and Chilliwack. They had a bunch of gravel trucks. And then Bill Drader, the guy that was driving at Leland, I worked for Public Freight. They used to be a freight outfit. Vanderspeck owned them. They were yellow and green. They did most of all the freight in the valley here in the lake and whatnot, and he ran the Chilliwack division. It was funny to meet these guys after, and then you get shooting the breeze about it. Anyway, but, it's hard to get it all out because you get too excited about. I had a real good life doing it. So, but anyway, we'll go back to 20 Mile, and then went in the shop, and there was a fairly big guy, and he told me, "Now watch your eyes." And it was Bill Ironsides. He had a welding shop after that in Chilliwack, and there was Ab Harvey, a mechanic there, and they were really good at telling, "Now you watch out and don't stand there," and whatnot. I'll never forget it. Bill Ironsides was brazing the head on a Model A pickup, a Roadster pickup. And nowadays, like, that's a Model A pickup with a soft top, like the convertible. And he was putting this gold across the top of it. Well, here, the head had broken half on it, and he had put it back on. I couldn't figure what he was doing with the gold, but then what it was brass. He was brazing the head. And then after, he spent quite a bit of time on it. He took it off, ground the face of it, and brazed that, and then he filed for a couple of days to get everything level again. And as far as I know, it worked, and it was just. And Clark's they must have been fairly good at inventing and monkey wrenching. And they couldn't buy anything then. There were no trucks or anything with the war on. They made a logging truck. It came in after, like, the trucks were going by the shop, dust flying and whatnot. And there was one, I think it was a little GM, they called it the Little Wonder. They're single axle and with a trailer and vacuum brakes, which I guess they made her, but they weren't very safe. But anyway, this other one came in, a guy driving it, and then the side he was hauling from, they were changing or moving, whatever. Anyway, he wasn't home, so he was going to change oil. So, of course, I was poking my nose in and whatnot. And when I went under it, it was a funny-looking truck because it had two radiators in it. And then when he was under there, and I crawled under there too, and here there's two oil pans. Okay, I never seen that before. So anyway, what it was, Clark Brothers had made it, and it had twin Chrysler engines in it, and they called it the Superman. And but not being able to buy trucks then, now whether it was an old one that they redid or whatnot, but anyway, it's funny, the last time I saw that truck, it was down off the Harrison River Bridge. Pretty's ended up buying Clark Brothers, and it was sitting there with a winch on the back, but somebody had taken just one engine in it then. But I thought that was quite a deal because there wasn't the big power they have now, and I guess two Chryslers would put out about 200 horse, so it would be a fairly good truck in them days. And no doors, nothing had doors on it, and fenders were nothing neither, but they're real easy to work on. What I could see, I could climb all over them like the motor, and you didn't have all that tin work to bother with. So it was just, I guess that's how logging was then. And then when we came out of there, I never got over it. I just always, and then my dad and another guy at night after supper, we're cutting shake bolts. They were cutting beautiful cedar, and they were just at the mouth of Mystery Valley, which was lots of beautiful straight cedar. And after supper, they'd take a gravel truck of Clark's and go out, and then they'd cut shingles. Well, shingles, they were blanks, and then bring them into camp. And then every twice a year or something, they'd load a scow up and bring a bunch down. And it's funny, the same cedar, not all of it, but after Dad died and we were cleaning up his place, that's not very 10 years ago, some of the cedar blocks were still there that had come there. It was beautiful straight cedar, and then it kind of brought memories back. And then anyway, from then on, like we could, at Hicks Lake where we lived when we came from there, I was really turned on with logging, and anytime you could hear whistles, you could hear the whistle and hear roaring, and I'd always head that way. Blondie Rustad was logging at Greenpoint, which is, it's all subdivision now, but he was logging around Hicks Lake, and from the end of Seabird where we lived, if you go up Camp Road, there used to be a real nice trail. You got into Hicks Lake, and there was a boat there, an old guy from Vancouver had a clinker-built boat, and you could use it as long as he had a bugle, and when he came fishing, he would blow the bugle and you brought the boat back. Other than that, you could use it. And when we were out there fishing, Blondie Rustad had the only steam pot yarder I had ever seen. It had a different whistle than the other yarders had because they were electric. It was really nice. It was quiet other than a bit of gear noise. But it didn't have a motor roaring.
Mm-hmm.
And it was beautiful to watch. I could watch it by the hour. And as far as I know, Rudy Marochi, he's a guy in Harrison, he punked whistles on it. And being steam, the whistles were a little slower than the electric one. But it really, I guess it turned me on for a kid that liked logging.